Tanse, my name is Amy Cardinal Christensen. I'm a Métis woman who is trying to relearn fire. My family has ties to Treaty 6 and Treaty 8 territory, now also known as Central and Northern Alberta in Canada. I want to acknowledge the territory and the ancestors where the conference is being held, specifically the ties to the Wurundjeri, Bunurong, Jajawarong, Tanjurwurrung, and Wadawurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin, and commit to doing everything in my power to advocate for Indigenous knowledge, land back, and empowerment of Indigenous peoples. I send you greetings from Treaty 6. And my daughter would like to add something too.
Me too. Hello, Australia.
Good job. The cardinal side of my family were members of Pieces Band 129 near Lac La Biche and Owl River. Chief Pieces, my uncle, signed on to Treaty 6 in 1876, wherein they agreed to enter into treaty with the Queen to share and avoid war. Many Indigenous peoples were starving because of the decimation of the buffalo by settlers, so had no other choice. The Labakan side of my family was from the White Horse Plains in Manitoba and moved west to follow the buffalo when colonizers started to disrupt their territory. They eventually settled in central Alberta. In 1885, both sides participated in the Northwest Resistance, where Métis and First Nations fought a war against the Canadian government. The day after the rebellion ended, the leader, Louis Riel, was executed. Members of my family were jailed, families fled and separated. My family withdrew from treaty as punishment and took scrip. This essentially meant that they were given land to give up their treaty rights. However, the land was soon taken back by the Crown anyways, because, in their opinion, my family wasn't farming it right. Their band, Pieces 129, disappeared, according to the government. My family continues to practice Woodland Cree and Métis traditions and maintained an active role in Indigenous communities in both the Lac La Biche and Fort McMurray areas. The impact of residential school, the consequences of the Indian Act, which pushed nations onto reserves, the racism, poverty, and vulnerability experienced through colonization tried to devastate nations, but we survived. Much of our knowledge also survived in our elders, but there is still struggle against injustice to be actually able to apply this knowledge. Indigenous nations in the Boreal forest hold significant knowledge about fire-driven landscapes and enact a set of practices and relationships with landscapes that burn. The pre-settlement landscape in Canada was strongly influenced by Indigenous land management to enhance productivity, with fire being the strongest means of landscape manipulation. As of 2021, there are over 600 primarily Indigenous communities in the North American Boreal biome that are disproportionately impacted by wildfire evacuations and smoke compared to the general population of Canada. The Canadian Forest Service has a wildland fire evacuation database that tracks wildland fire evacuations from 1980 to 2021. 1989 was the evacuations of multiple Indigenous communities in northern Manitoba. 2003 was our first major urban evacuation of a portion of the city of Kelowna and the smaller community of Barriere. 2011 included the evacuation of Slave Lake, where numerous homes were burned. 2015 included the evacuation of multiple Indigenous communities in northern Saskatchewan. 2016 had fewer evacuation events, but the largest number of wildfire evacuees in Canadian history, with 100,000 people evacuated from the city of Fort McMurray with a single evacuation order, which also resulted in the largest number of homes burned. 2017 and 2018 were significant years with multiple evacuations across British Columbia. And the 2021 fire season was really off the board, with 217 evacuation events in multiple locations across Canada, including the destruction of the entire community of Lytton, British Columbia, and the loss of 2 people. This map shows wildfire evacuation events across Canada between 1980 and 2021. The orange dots are evacuations of Indigenous communities, and the size of the dot correlates to the number of evacuations the community has had. showing how Indigenous communities more frequently experience wildfire evacuations, particularly through the boreal forest. Despite making up only 5% of the Canadian population, 42% of evacuation events in Canada from wildfire have been of Indigenous communities, showing the disproportionate impact on Indigenous peoples. Despite being so highly impacted by wildfire events, Indigenous nations are still largely kept out of wildfire decision making in their territories. Fire research and management in Canada over the last century has effectively erased Indigenous voices. Much of the literature focus in the boreal biome has been on biophysical research by non Indigenous researchers who sought to document the roles of fire in the boreal forest without including Indigenous peoples in the process. This, coupled with the systemic barriers to Indigenous access to the Academy, has translated to very few articles published by Indigenous peoples on this topic, and even fewer by Indigenous peoples documenting the knowledge of their own nations. I'd like to credit my colleagues, Dr. Colin Sutherland, Dr. Faisal Mullah, Dr. Heather McDonald, David Young, and Noemi Gonzalez Batiste, who have greatly influenced my thinking on this matter when we wrote our paper, Centering Indigenous Voices, the Role of Fire in the Boreal Forest of North America. Part of this keynote quotes important text directly from that paper, so I want to ensure that my co-authors are properly acknowledged. We present more than 36 species, including vascular plants, insects, and mammals, referenced in the literature, as managed by Indigenous peoples in the boreal forest using fire. Among the plants and animals that benefit from fire are Indigenous cultural keystone species that, quote, shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people, as reflected in the fundamental roles these species have in diet, materials, medicine, and/or spiritual practices. They include moose, bison, and numerous berry-producing shrubs, including wild huckleberry and a variety of blueberry species that are important as both food and medicinal plants. Indigenous burners were highly skilled in knowing when the time to burn was and how to achieve the cultural outcomes they wanted. It was taken very seriously, as a burning mistake would have severe repercussions on a nation, including starvation and death. The idea was to promote what you needed around where you live, so an out of control wildfire could have terrible impacts. We call on our non Indigenous colleagues who research on and write about the boreal forest to include Indigenous peoples and perspectives in their work, not as footnotes or in the acknowledgement sections, but as equal peers and collaborators. Indigenous peoples have long understood that humans were not the only agents of change in the boreal forest. For Cree people, for example, fire is seen as a being that has a spirit. Offerings like tobacco or sage are made to the fire spirit in ceremony, as described by Philip Campio, Cree elder. Janelle Marie Baker has documented a creation story from Big Stone Cree Nation elder Albert Yellowknee, where she asked about fire use in the boreal forest. Quote, "The Creator breathes fire into two poplar trees for them to become humans. In this sense, fire is a life-giving force. He reminded me that everything is interconnected, fire included," end quote. For many, this understanding of sacred fire persists. More than simply a form of combustion, landscape fires are understood as being connected to a wider set of human-land relationships, pointing to important Indigenous concepts of kinship and reciprocity. Historically, by viewing the boreal forest as empty rather than tended landscapes, settlers made the argument that land inhabited by Indigenous peoples was free to occupy, using the justifications of the doctrine of discovery and associated terra nullius, or empty land, to justify their actions of dispossession and occupation. In reality, Indigenous peoples in the boreal forest have intentionally modified their landscapes for thousands of years, in part through burning practices. The dominant narrative of wildfire history in the boreal forest focuses on large-scale, periodic, stand-replacing fires. Indeed, most published histories of wildfire gloss over or do not mention frequent small-scale fires, including Indigenous burning practices, that are often missed by large-scale measurements. Fate, for example, attributes all fires in the Boreal territory of the Mistassini Indians as lightning caused and states, quote, in the boreal forest region, while Aboriginal man undoubtedly has had a considerable effect, natural causes, namely lightning, provide an adequate explanation and appears to have been at work prior to the presence of man. End quote. Bell is another example of an account of boreal fire laced with hurtful stereotypes of Indigenous peoples, including, quote, an Indian will seldom do anything except by necessity, end quote. Bell, like other historical scientists, completely ignored Indigenous cultural practices and knowledge systems in the Boreal, despite relying on Indigenous peoples extensively as guides and likely presenting the knowledge they shared as his own discoveries. Many myths have swirled, including the careless native, who would have left campfires unattended and undertook other careless activities involving fire. Erika Oberndorfer also discusses the biases behind historical accounts of fires and Indigenous burning practices in Labrador, including a European settler pyrophobia, and authors who had no experience with the benefits of fire in a boreal context. I am always reminded of this tweet by mapmaker David. Quote, instead of treating colonial explorers' accounts as primary sources, we should just treat those works as ethnographic material that is not about the native or indigenous group, but about the colonizer's culture. End quote. Importantly, the boreal biome's many ecosystems are continuously transformed by lightning-ignited fires that travel across landscapes, with profound implications for human and non-human beings alike. The resulting mosaic of forest and wetland communities are a major driver of renewal and opportunity. While most research on human-fire relationships is preoccupied with the Indigenous use of fire, it is important to note that all fires in the Boreal are entangled with human relationships, even those that are perceived to be wild. To understand the boreal forest as a landscape in the making contributes to a wider appreciation for Indigenous knowledge and forms of land care native to this expansive and diverse landscape. This approach also invites a critical analysis of how relationships between Indigenous peoples, fire, and Indigenous knowledge have been suppressed, interrupted, and erased. We need to see this region as more than an ecological landscape, but rather an Indigenous cultural landscape. Historically, settler governments criminalized Indigenous fire practices, thereby disrupting the land use practices of Indigenous peoples in the Boreal. These actions have led to long-term impact for both Indigenous nations and the boreal ecosystem that are felt to this day. The suppression of fire as a traditional and customary management practice can be thought of as cultural severance, first coined by Rothenham, defined as an act, intentionally or not, that functionally disrupts relationships between people and the land. The impacts of cultural severance are diverse. They include the loss of valued biocultural components, broad successional shifts in landscapes, declines in unique biodiversity, including pyrospecies, declines in wildlife population and culturally significant plants, and even facilitating the spread of invasive species. In the specific context of anthropogenic fire, the impacts of cultural severance can also increase vulnerability to catastrophic fires because of increases in fuel buildup and continuity. Fire bans on cultural burning implemented by settler administrations were consistent with a wider set of strategies that aim to criminalize relationships between Indigenous nations, land, and each other. Examples of other strategies include the control of travel onto the land, forced sedentarization and displacement from their territories, the establishment and maintenance of the reserve system, and residential schools. The impact of assimilation efforts on nations has been to disrupt the transmission of Indigenous knowledge. These impacts vary by nation and geographic region, with different periods of trade and settlement leading to a varied colonial experience. Many nations are located in rural, sometimes remote forested regions, experiencing the impacts of climate change and policies of attempted fire exclusion, resulting in increased fire suppression challenges. Due to climate and forest field changes, Indigenous communities are at increased risk of evacuations and wildfire-related impacts. Further, fire prevention policies in Canada and Alaska have reduced the use of fire by Indigenous peoples in the Boreal, although some still burn in their territories. Settler governments have also excluded First Nations from decision-making about fire management policies. Many fire management agencies have now come to accept fire as a natural, needed process in many forests, but have taken an extreme stance in some areas that has major impacts on Indigenous peoples and cultural landscapes. For instance, strategic planning about allowing fires north of the 51st parallel neglected to consult local First Nations. In Alaska, the Koyukuk and Northern Unit Inukjuat National Wildlife Refuge Fire Management Plan, quote, failed to acknowledge the variability in wildfire reported by Indigenous people and highlighted only the potentially desirable effects, end quote. Out of control wildfires during summer have been devastating to traditional territories throughout the Boreal. Management decisions defining where fire suppression efforts occur has reflected a lack of recognition of the existence and values of Indigenous nations. In northern Saskatchewan, for example, Indigenous groups did not consent to, quote, let it burn fire policies, unquote, where suppression was not conducted if government determined values were not at risk. Even for Indigenous people who may not currently practice local fire knowledge, given the fact that fire management impacts their territories, greater consideration and actions must be taken to involve Indigenous peoples and secure their perspectives in future fire management decision making. There is increasing interest in Indigenous fire stewardship, but much of that revolves around the romanticism of Indigenous knowledge and the idea that Indigenous knowledge is not applicable to today. Although provincial, territorial, and federal fire management agencies in Canada in recent decades have shown a greater acceptance for using fire on the landscape, agency-certified burners with Western prescribed fire techniques predominate, such as the use of accelerants and production burning techniques, such as replicating high-intensity fire over large areas. Much of the interest in cultural burning from non-Indigenous folks and agencies is around appropriating knowledge from Indigenous nations. We always hear the terms integrate, collect, gather. How many reports by government agencies and non-Indigenous researchers have you seen lately that talk about integrating or incorporating Indigenous knowledge about fire, including cultural burning practices, into their colonial management systems? But cultural knowledge can never survive in colonial institutions. Allies should be using their positions of power to support Indigenous-led fire management. There is much more work still to be done on shifting the power dynamics around wildfire decision making. One of the common themes we hear is one of shared responsibility, but I want to focus on a point raised by my colleague, Dr. Crystal Colden, at the Fire and Climate Conference in Pasadena. Often those who are the most vulnerable to fire simply cannot reduce their risk, not just because of financial constraints or that they just don't want to, but because of systems that keep them vulnerable. As well, most of the discourse around shared responsibility is directed at individuals and not at collective action that can be taken as a society. For Indigenous nations, this includes restrictions on their ability to use fire. This enthusiasm to engage Indigenous knowledge about fire must also include discussions regarding Indigenous leadership and engagement in forest and wildfire management decisions, including training, certification, and liability issues. Indigenous people should not only be informing decision makers, there needs to be a shift in power so that they are the ones who are making decisions about their own territories. We need to acknowledge shared goals and move backwards from them. If we want the same thing in the end, like a healthy ecosystem, does it really matter who is holding the match at the beginning of the day? Such efforts to revitalize cultural burning have made direct reference in Canada to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and Section 34 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I always find it frustrating that agencies are allowed to make mistakes around fire, but Indigenous people aren't. I attended a talk at a conference that was a humorous take on the mistakes made in prescribed fire in conservation areas and lessons learned. And while I'll admit it was kind of funny to hear multiple stories about non Indigenous people struggling with fire, I couldn't imagine if Indigenous peoples did those same things and made those same mistakes. It's a racist double standard we need to address. I also constantly hear about barriers, liability, legislation, land ownership, training, certification. But Indigenous nations worldwide are addressing these. California and the work of Don Hankins, Ron W. Good, Bill Tripp, Frank Lake, Margot Robbins, and others are a fantastic example of how legislation can be changed around liability. The Fire Sticks Alliance with Ollie Costello, Victor Stephenson, Rachel Stephenson, Ada Webster, Vanessa Kavanaugh, and others is a good example of how cultural burn certification and training opportunities can be created for our nations by our nations. People created these systems we now exist in. We can change them. We need to use power and money vested in agencies and academic institutions to lead change. For example, if you're an ally working in an agency, you don't need to learn about Indigenous burning techniques. Our children and youth need to learn that first from our own nations, and they haven't had that opportunity. You need to use your position to change the system that you operated in to break down systemic racism so that we can teach our children and youth. That is the best form of allyship. In summary, for the Indigenous nations I work with, my Indigenous colleagues, and myself, it's about more than fire. It's about sharing with children and youth, sharing with our elders, connection to territory, mental and physical health, restoration of territory, Indigenous autonomy, and land back. Sure, fire is cool, but what is cooler is watching a youth engage for the first time in their culture and with their elders. A generation ago, children were beaten for speaking their language. Now we can give them opportunities to relearn good ways and feel pride about the work their ancestors did and where they come from. It is truly about the 7 generations. At a meeting I was at, someone said, well, if we allow cultural burning, Indians are just going to be running around burning everywhere. And I thought, exactly as it should be.